the hard one. Yes, graduate student.
You mentioned earlier in your 5 assumptions, the 5th assumption was that states are fully rational actors. If states are fully rational, then we can fully predict their actions. I mean, they take an optimal path based on budget constraints, and from there we can make very accurate predictions. Unfortunately, we have seen through the course of history that states are not always rational. So how can we make this?
Let me make 2 points. This has to deal with the rational actor assumption. I think that if states are fully rational, it still is often difficult to predict what they will do. And there are 2 reasons for that. One is that we never have perfect information in international politics. I can be very rational in deciding whether or not to marry a particular woman, but I can never have perfect information about that person and how that person is going to behave over the course of her lifetime. Okay? So you can be rational, but because we don't live in a world where states have perfect information, you sometimes just guess wrong. Second reason is that states sometimes go to great lengths to bamboozle you, to trick you, to deceive you. And you sometimes just get misled. I just finished this book. It's a short little book. It's called Why Leaders Lie, the Truth About Lying in International Politics. And the point I make in the book is that states sometimes lie for good strategic reasons to deceive their adversaries. So I would disagree with you on your point that if you are rational and everybody else is rational, you can predict the future and you can know what each state's going to do. However, I think the more important point is that states sometimes do not act rationally, which contradicts my theory. This is very important now. I think of all the problems that exist with my theory, the biggest problems come with the rational actor assumption. I don't go around advertising that point, but I agree with this gentleman's point that when you look out there at the world, there's a lot of stupid behavior, right? Okay, but I just want to say that, remember how I concluded the talk? I said that sometimes my theory is wrong. And I told you that all theories fail from time to time. They face cases which we call anomalies, theories cases that the theory can't explain. Offensive realism, or realism's biggest problem, I believe, comes with cases where states don't act rationally. They just go out and do foolish things. So I think your point that the rational actor assumption doesn't always work is correct. And that's the limitation, the most significant limitation on the theory.
It's the same as you demonstrated with the war in 2003.
Yes, you're right, war.
But it's an assumption, right? Yes, please.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for your very interesting and specific perspective on the topic. But I would like to refer to your second part of your speech, where you focus on the U.S.-American politics. If you look at the world news today, that China is visiting Germany during this week with 38 different versions of business contracts, don't you think that just focusing on the U.S.-American politics within the perspective of China is a bit too narrow, the perspective?
I'll repeat the question because I assume that most people in the back didn't hear it. First of all, you're welcome, and thanks for the invitation to be here. Our question was, this past week, there were a number of Chinese businessmen and leaders who were visiting Germany, and all sorts of economic relations are developing between Germany and China, and I think more generally between Europe and China. And aren't I leaving out that dimension of the story and too narrowly focusing on the U.S.-American dyad, as we say in international politics? Is that a fair statement? Okay. What this gets at are two factors. First of all, it gets at the whole question of how Europe fits in to the U.S.-China competition. It is not clear to me that you Europeans, and I use Europeans in a very broad sense here, that you Europeans are going to side with the Americans against the Chinese. There's no question that the Russians, in my mind, that the Russians, the Japanese, the Indians, the Vietnamese, the South Koreans, we're all going to be very tight. No question. But the question is, what does Europe do in this one? I don't think you have a dog in the fight. And I don't think you're going to want to go out there and spend lots of money projecting power out into the Pacific Ocean to help the United States contain China. You Europeans are excellent buck passers. You've done a wonderful job. I take my hat off to you, getting Uncle Sam to pay enormous amounts of money to defend you, right? And I don't think you're going to be willing, and I don't blame you, I'm not being critical here. I don't think you're going to be willing to help us contain China. And I think you're going to be willing to deal with the Chinese. Right? I think that's what's happening here. I think the Chinese smell that they can come to Europe and they can have all sorts of economic intercourse with Europe. Right? So I think it's partly surprising that this is happening, and I think you'll see more of it. And the question you want to ask yourself is, what does that mean for U.S.-European relations as China continues to rise and the U.S.-China rivalry heats up? Where does Europe fit in that story? Okay. So that's one point. But let's just take that all off the table. It's also very important to understand that you can have a great deal of economic interaction or economic intercourse or globalization, and you can still have a very serious competition between the relevant countries and even have a war. As most people who study IR know, there was a great deal of economic interdependence in Europe before World War I. And by the way, if you look at the USSR, the Soviet Union, and Nazi Germany before June 22nd, 1941, when Germans went into the Soviet Union, there was a huge amount of economic intercourse between those two countries. It's really quite amazing. So I would just say to you that there's a lot of this economic interaction, these economic interactions taking place. But I do not think they will have the pacifying effects that many people think they will.
Yes.
Keeping in mind that Greece in the near future could not become the regional hegemon, wouldn't it actually be realistic and towards its survival to drop the realistic approach and try to convince other countries, in this case the Europeans, that they should aid Greece?
Well, there's no question that the Greeks should try to convince the Europeans to help Greece with its economic problems and to dig out and to sort of get back on track, okay? But with regard to the question of whether Greece should abandon, let's call it a realist approach, and focus on others, I think the answer is no. I think in this world, whether you're Greece or Turkey or Serbia, you want to have as much military power as you can afford, and you want to go to great lengths to have alliances with countries like the United States, if you can do it, so that you'll be protected. But the problem is that you can't ultimately depend on another country to protect you, because countries like the United States might not be there for you. And if they're not there for you, right, you're going to have to take care of yourself. So if I'm Greece, I worry about the size of my population, I worry about how much wealth I have relative to my neighbors, and I want to make sure that I have, you know, as much military capability as I can afford to discourage any other country from behaving aggressively. So I'm not against cooperating. If I'm Greece, I'm not against cooperating with other European countries and getting assistance, especially in these hard economic times. But on the other hand, I pay very careful attention to the whole question of how I defend myself now and in the future. Could you stand up, please, just so everybody can hear?
Mr. Mearsheimer, in this case of possible hegemonic antagonism you're describing, in my mind there's a new factor, and I want your comment on that. It's the case of, it's a factor of that China has, you say, the United States owe China a large amount of money on behalf of it. How this reality will affect this hegemonic antagonism in the future?
Good question. The question is, given that China holds a huge amount of America's debt and therefore has a significant amount of leverage over us, how will this affect future relations between the two countries? I think that on the margins, the factor that you describe makes it less likely that we will have a conflict. I think given the factor that you described, given the fact that the Chinese hold all that American debt, it will make us less reluctant, or more reluctant to get into a fight with the Chinese. But I actually believe that when push comes to shove in a crisis situation, politics trumps economics. And if you look at what the Chinese say about Taiwan, the Chinese say, we do not, under any circumstances, want a war with the West or with the United States at this point in time. All we Chinese want to do is continue to grow economically. However, they say, sort of contradicts their blanket statement, they make it clear that if Taiwan declares its independence, they will go to war. That's another way of saying that politics will trump economics. Okay? And my final point to you would be, I don't think China is going to hold all that American debt forever and ever. And I think there will come a point, who knows when that's no longer the case. And that will not matter very much.
Professor, first of all, thank you for being here today. You were very clear to the point that there is an element of containment in the U.S. strategy towards China. There are some authors who entertain the idea that the United States promotes new poles in the unfolding balance of power in Asia. I'm referring to Japan and India. You mentioned the strengthening of the third leg, say, of the hub-and-spoke system, and the trilateral dimension between the United States, Japan, Australia. But when it came to India, India pulled back because of China's complaints about the containment dimension in this strategy. Of course, there are many ways to contain China, but how would this work, given the economic dimension? It's like follow-up on the other question. There are many people who support the idea that South Korea, a traditional ally of the United States, is bandwagoning towards China. What do you believe about it? And of course, Australia lately has probably adopted a strategy of hedging, probably. So it has this dual strategy.
Yeah. There are a number of questions embedded in that one big question. First of all, South Korea will be with the United States. There's no question about that. Your point was that Australia is hedging. I think that's true, but that won't last for very long. They're going to have to make a choice, and the choice is very clear. They'll go with us. I believe Indonesia will go with us. To revert to India, your point that the Indians are backing off, I don't think that's true at all. The Indians are much more fearful of the Chinese than the Americans are, in large part because they share a border with China, and that border is a disputed border, and they fought a war over it in the early 1960s. And we have very close relations with the Indians now because of China. Just to tell you a quick story here, it's a bit off the beaten path. I often say to students, why is the United States and India, why are the United States and India such good friends today? And as you would expect, the automatic American response is, it's because they're both democracies, and democracies are always friends. And I would say to people, that cannot be the answer, because the Indians and the Americans were actually bitter rivals during most of the Cold War, and they were both democracies. What changed was the Soviet Union went away, and China is now looming as a threat in Asia. And it's that Chinese threat that's driving the Indians and the Americans together, right? And the Chinese threaten the Indians in two ways. One is on the borders, right, up in the north of India, but also in the Indian Ocean. The Chinese are talking about building a blue water navy and coming into the Indian Ocean. This scares the living bejesus out of the Indians and the Americans as well. So the Indians, the South Koreans, the Australians, they'll all be with us. Pakistan, I think, is the really interesting question. Somebody looking for a good thesis topic, you know. That's a good thesis topic. What is Pakistan likely to do in India? In the U.S.-China competition. Now, how do we contain China? You contain China with military forces. That's how you do it. And we are going to move lots of assets, additional assets into Asia, and those Asian countries are going to spend lots of money on defense. And by the way, here's another issue that's coming up. When I come back in 10 years, we'll see if this is true. I believe that's a problem, so I'll be back. I believe that the Japanese are likely to go nuclear. The Japanese are already talking about this behind closed doors. Japanese are very worried about North Korea, number one, the fact that North Korea has nuclear weapons, and they're very worried about China. There are these small islands, basically rocks, that are disputed between China and Japan. They're called the Senkaku Islands in Japanese. And there was a big incident late last year involving a Chinese fishing trawler in the Senkaku Islands area. And I would not be surprised if, I don't think it's likely, but I'm just saying I wouldn't be surprised if the Chinese and the Japanese ended up shooting each other over the Senkaku Islands. And the Japanese are beginning to reason to themselves that the best way to deter the Chinese and make sure that doesn't happen is for Japan to have nuclear weapons. Because if you're Japan and you have nuclear weapons, the Chinese are going to be very reluctant to fool around with you, for fear that it will escalate to the nuclear level. If you don't have nuclear weapons and you defend on the American nuclear umbrella, the Americans are not going to use nuclear weapons to defend Japan. It's just too dangerous. So the Japanese kind of understand that. So that's another thing that you'll see happening. And just your initial point. Your initial point is we're pushing these Asian countries to do more for themselves. You're right, we're pushing them. And you know why we're pushing them? Because we understand that containing China is going to be a wicked task. It's going to be really difficult. And to do it properly, we're going to need allies who are not good buck passers. See, the United States allowed itself to be played for a sucker in the Cold War. We allowed the Asians and the Europeans not to spend much money on defense. Well, we spent tons of money. Number one, we're now bankrupt. But number two, China is, if it turns into a giant Taiwan, you all understand that at the height of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union was at its peak, it had about one-third the gross national product of the United States. And you know how much trouble the Soviets caused us, how much we worried about them, with one-third the GNP of the United States. If China turns into a giant Hong Kong, you're talking about a country that probably has somewhere in the range of 2 to 3 times the GNP of the United States. 2 to 3 times the GNP. This is a country that has 4 times as many people, and in this scenario, 2 to 3 times the GNP, and we're fighting them in their backyard 6,000 miles away from us. This is not a good situation. We're going to need all the help we can get. And that brings me back to the point of what the Europeans do.
Can I ask you something, sir?
Sure.
Don't you think that China is going too far? I mean, to be more accurate, how can China be a potential hegemon without enough naval power? And I would like to make your comment on this, distinguishing between military power and naval power. Thank you very much.
Okay. Did everybody hear the question? You did? Okay. First of all, we are talking about a scenario 20 years down the road. China today is a paper tiger. The Chinese Navy is no match for the American Navy. As you surely know, the Chinese are refurbishing this old Soviet aircraft carrier. This is a joke. I mean, I can't believe that they're foolish enough, the Chinese, talk about irrational behavior, building an aircraft carrier that's nothing more than one of those old Soviet rust heaps. It's foolish, right? So they do not have the capability to put a blue water navy afloat today. That's not in the cards. The question is, what's that navy going to look like in 20 or 30 years when this place is a giant Hong Kong? And I'll assure you that they'll have a very powerful navy. Second point is, you asked me to distinguish between naval power and military power, meaning basically army or land power. Very good question. Here's the problem that we face with China. The problem is that China itself is a giant aircraft carrier. So we, Americans, have a great deal of our military capability in our aircraft carriers. And let's just assume we had 15 carriers. We're not going to be able to put those 15 carriers anywhere near China 20, 30 years from now, because they'll be sunk to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean like that. First of all, there's going to be all that land-based aircraft on that giant aircraft carrier. Second, we now have a situation with overhead satellites and smart ballistic missiles where it's almost impossible for surface ships to survive. Right? That brings up the third problem that we face, which is submarines are going to matter a lot more, relatively speaking, in the future, and they're going to be Chinese submarines all over the Asia-Pacific region. So we're going to have a great deal of difficulty bringing naval power up to the Chinese coast. And where we're going to have to play the game is by stationing forces in places like Japan and maybe in Taiwan. But there we face the problem that the Chinese are building so many ballistic missiles, right, that it's going to be hard to maintain air forces on the Japanese mainland and on Taiwan. Right? So this is the real problem. The area where we basically have a great advantage over the Chinese is not in the Asia-Pacific region when you talk about naval forces, which is where I just was. The area where we have a big advantage is in the Indian Ocean. because the Chinese have to bring their navy into the Indian Ocean. And when they bring their navy into the Indian Ocean, it is vulnerable to forces that are in India, and it's vulnerable to the American Navy. So in the Asia-Pacific region, naval power is going to be of limited utility. Military power, I think, will be more important. And I think to the extent that naval power matters, it will be submarines. That would be my sense.
No. So get the questions.
Yeah, I'll take it.
There's only groups of three or one?
One is easy. I'll make my answer shorter.
Okay. Well, let's take the first issue.
Hello. I would like to ask you if the conflict between China will evolve into a second Cold War or a third World War. Thank you.
My view is that the conflict will evolve into a second World War, a second Cold War. And I do not think there is any chance it will be a third World War. I do think, however, that it is possible that the United States and China will end up in a shooting match, in a war, but it will be a limited war because of the fear of nuclear escalation. I talked about the Senkaku Islands, I talked about the South China Sea, I talked about Taiwan. We could talk about a war breaking out on the Korean Peninsula and the Chinese and the Americans getting involved. I can tell you a number of plausible stories, not likely stories, but plausible stories about how the United States and China end up in a shooting match. But they all involve limited wars, because I think the presence of nuclear weapons will make it impossible to have World War III. So it would be the Cold War with some hot fights involved. And remember, in the Cold War, the United States and the Soviets never shot at each other.
Professor, I would like to ask you the following. I understood that there is a great difference between a usual understanding of realism and your understanding of realism. Unfortunately, the usual one prevails in Greece as well. In a few words, according to the usual definition, realism is thought to be about surrendering to your current position. But your very own description of American history and the Monroe Doctrine in particular shows that realism has a strong element of political voluntarism. So it's not about what you are, from what I understand. It's about what you want to become in order to preserve an unattained goal, which is survival. Survival is not at hand, it's something to be achieved. So a realistic policymaker needs always to see ahead and see what his state needs to become. So this is my question. Do you agree that realism entails this element of political voluntarism? Or is it about surrendering to your current position and act accordingly?
Well, as you know, there's this big divide among realists. There's offensive realists and defensive realists. And defensive realists, and this includes most of my friends, and Kenneth Waltz, who was here, is the defensive realist par excellence. They all believe that acquiring more power is really not a good thing. And what you should do is just maintain the balance of power. And I, of course, believe that you should look for opportunities to increase your power base, and you should try and maximize your relative power. And indeed, I think that China would be smart to try and dominate Asia. I tell the Chinese this when I go over there. You'd be smart to dominate Asia. I'm not sure you can do it. In fact, I don't think you can, but you ought to try. I'd try if I were running your country. Right? So you can see the fundamental difference there. The question is, who's right or wrong? Now, obviously, I think I'm right and they're wrong. And I'll tell you why I think I'm right and they're wrong very quickly. If you look at the empirical record, what you see is that great powers have historically acted very aggressively. I only talked about the United States. Let's talk about Germany. Let's talk about the Soviet Union / Russia. Let's talk about Japan. Great powers have a rich history of going on rampages, conquering other countries, throwing their weight around. The United States of America today, most of you probably don't realize this, we have been at war for 2 out of every 3 years since the Cold War ended. We have been at war for 14 of the last 21 years, and there's no end in sight. And they're even talking about starting another one against Iran. Right? So, if you ask Ken Waltz, how do you account for that? He says states are not rational. Gets back to the question over there. Right? He says it's domestic politics, right? The states behaving in foolish ways. Right? So what I would say to you is that the defensive realists cannot explain with their realist theory how the world works. And that's why they have to use these unit level, these domestic politics theories, which are not realist theories. My theory, which says states do behave aggressively, is much more consistent with the historical record.
Let me be clear for some of you who are not from the two departments that when we're speaking about realism, we're talking about theory, whether defensive or offensive. And this is what we've done here is a theoretical exercise to see not through cards or going to the oracles, but a theoretical exercise of what this will become, not just coming out of anybody's mind. It's what theory says. Not just over there, too.
I would like to ask Professor.
Could you stand up and just talk a little louder?
I would like to ask two issues. The first one, your comment about the role of Russia, taking into consideration that it's the only power in military terms that we can say that it's still a superpower. And the second one is, what's your opinion about the theory of democratic peace?
Okay. The first question had to do with Russia, and which this gentleman described as still a superpower. First of all, I don't think that Russia is a superpower. I do believe that Russia and China and the United States are the 3 great powers in the world. But I believe only one of those 3 great powers is a superpower, and it's obviously the United States. For me, to be a superpower, you have to be able to project military power outside of your region of the world. That's the usual definition of a superpower. And I don't think the Russians have that capability. With regard to the future, I think Russia is a country that is going to get steadily weaker and weaker with the passage of time. Russia is a country that is in really terrible shape, and the future is bleak. There are 2 reasons for that. One is demographics. This is a country that is shrinking in population size. It's going to get much smaller. And furthermore, in terms of its economy, it's not reformed its economy in any meaningful ways. And the only reason it's doing as well as it is doing is because of oil and gas. And a country that doesn't have a powerful industrial base doesn't have a bright future. So I don't worry about the Russians at all. And I'm actually quite amazed that so many Americans can't forget the Cold War and they still worry about the Russians. The Russians are just not a serious problem. The Chinese are a serious problem. And we ought to hope the Russians don't get too weak, because we're going to need the Russians to help us contain the Chinese. And my great fear is that the Russians won't be there because they'll be too weak. With regard to democratic peace theory, I'm not going to answer that question in any detail because it would take me an hour to answer it. But as you know, I don't think democratic peace theory is a very good theory. I think it is the best liberal theory. I think it is the best non-realist theory on the table. If you ask me which theory is the most difficult one for you to deal with, John, I'd say it's democratic peace theory. I think the biggest problem with democratic peace theory is the theory is so weak. We do not have a good explanation, I believe, for why democracies are supposed to be peaceful with each other. But I'll stop there only because I don't want to go on for an hour.
Well, I think it will be the last I will give to a member of the faculty.
Right. Professor Mearsheimer, I would like to ask you if you think that the economic and social model of China is conducive to innovation, especially engineering, because I think that it's probably the case that without military technology, there is no capability in the future. So the question is, do you really think, with the data that you have, that the economic and social model they have is conducive to innovation, to engineering? So that brings, projection of military technology in the near future.
Yeah. First of all, I think the key is not so much military technology, it's just technology in general, right? And for the Chinese economy to continue to grow, it has to be able to develop the most sophisticated technologies, period. And those, of course, include military technologies. But that point aside, I don't have a good answer to that question, mainly because it's not my area of expertise. I think it's a terribly important question. And one could argue that it's the question that underpins, or one of the questions that underpins my whole analysis. Because remember, I said in the beginning, I was going to assume that China will continue to grow. And your question, of course, is, do they have an economic and social system that will allow them to grow and present this possible threat? Just on this very issue, this gentleman before you raised the question about democratic peace theory. And as I was answering this question, I was thinking about Frank Fukuyama's very famous article at the end of the Cold War. It was called, for those of you who don't remember it, Why We Will, The End of History, right, The End of History. Frank wrote this piece called The End of History. And the basic argument is that during the first half of the 20th century, the West fought against fascism and defeated it, and took it off the table. In the second half of the 20th century, the West, and here he's talking about liberal democracies with capitalist economies, the West fought against communism and defeated communism. So first fascism, then communism were finished off. And the Fukuyama thesis was that the future of the world was one where you would have states that all looked alike. What he really meant was they would all look like the United States. They would all be liberal democracies with capitalist economic systems. Okay? And as you know, in the 1990s, many people thought that what was happening was that Russia was abandoning its authoritarian, centrally controlled economy, and it was moving towards the American model. Many people thought that that was the direction that the Chinese would go. And by the way, to go back to your question, the Fukuyama thesis is that the biggest problem we will face in the future is boredom. That's what he said, B-O-R-E-D-O-M, boredom. Why did he believe that the biggest problem we would face in the future was boredom? Because he believes in democratic peace theory. And if every country in the world is becoming a liberal democracy like the United States, right, and you believe in democratic peace theory, there's not going to be any war. Therefore, boredom. Or what I like to call peace, love, and go. Okay? However, what's happened, and this gets back to your question, what's happened is that it's quite clear that not everybody is moving towards the American model. And what we see are these authoritarian or semi-authoritarian states, like China, that appear to be doing very well. And the question then becomes, can China remain non-democratic? I mean, a different variant of your questions. A lot of people say, this communist-run state, it's not an old-fashioned communist state like we knew during the Cold War, but it's still not a democracy. It doesn't look like the United States or Greece or any European country, which is certainly true. And a lot of people say, this is not going to work. And a lot of people say that a non-capitalist, country, a country that's not built on the American model, can't work. But when you look out there today at which economies are working and which are not working, the Chinese economy looks like it's doing better than the American economy. Now, a lot of my economist friends at the University of Chicago will say, just wait, right? Just wait. You don't have free markets, you don't have American capitalism, you die over the long term, and we will prevail. I don't know, right? I don't know what the answer is to that question. I think it's a great question, and I'm not going to answer it only because I don't know what to say. But it is, a question of great importance.
I think the privilege of the moderator or moderators is to ask the very last question. Of course, is one that you may wish to talk about for hours, but it's up to you. What is the future of our theory of IR, including realism, defensive and offensive? I think it's an opportunity having you here to give us your estimate or your assessment of where the theory of IR goes and how the dominant paradigm is going to evolve or not.
I won't talk for an hour on that subject. I'll try and talk for 5 minutes.
Good.
First of all, I believe that theory is enormously important for how we deal with the world, whether you're talking about international politics or inter-family relations. For those of you who will eventually have children, when your children misbehave, you'll have to determine whether you're going to holler at them, whether you're going to try and speak reason to them, whether you're going to spank them. And which one of those approaches you employ is a function of the theories that you have in your head. Everything we do on a daily basis is informed by the theories that we have in our head about how the world works. And what we are constantly doing is we are updating those theories based on the empirical evidence that we acquire from day to day. If you take one approach of dealing with your children and it doesn't work, and then you talk to one of your friends who's taken a different approach and he or she says it's working very well, you then change the theory and you act towards your child in different ways the next time he or she misbehaves, right? So the point I would make to you, and if I can leave you with one point today, you never want to underestimate the importance of theory. Theory is God, no matter what realm you are dealing with. So when we talk about international politics and how you think about the world, right, it's very important to understand the importance of theory. I'll just tell you one quick story since I have the floor here. I won a book award for the tragedy of great power politics. And I went to Washington, D.C., to Georgetown University to get the book award. And I ended up sitting next to Madeleine Albright at the dinner. And Madeleine Albright hates theory. And she thinks that it's, fuzzy-headed academics like me who live in hyperspace most of the time who do theory while she does policy. And I, of course, believe that the two are inextricably linked. So she, at the dinner, made a number of dismissive remarks. And we were just having a private conversation at the dinner. She made a number of dismissive remarks about theory. IR theory. And of course, this was to honor the tragedy of great power politics, this book award. So it was a very theory-oriented book. But anyway, I said to her, I said, I'm really surprised that you're bashing theory. because I consider you to be an important IR theorist. And I actually use your writings in my class to illustrate the importance of theory. So you can see the smoke coming out. What is this guy talking about? So she said to me, I don't understand what you're talking about. So I said, well, let me tell you. I said, you're a liberal, and there are three great liberal theories of international politics. One is democratic peace theory, two is economic interdependence theory, which we're talking about, and three is liberal institutionalism. And I said, what I tell students is that when they look at the justifications that you and others in the Clinton administration gave for number one, NATO expansion, and number two, for engagement with China, if you read the speeches of Madeleine Albright, if you read the writings of people like Strobe Talbot in the New York Review of Books on NATO expansion, what you see is that the rationale is couched in those three liberal theories. Just to give you an example, NATO expansion. Number one, you want to move institutions like NATO and eventually the EU eastward. You want to get all these East European, these former communist countries, embedded in institutions. Furthermore, you want to move the EU and NATO eastward so you can reinforce and improve the democracies that have sprouted up in Eastern Europe. Democratic peace theory, neoliberal institutionalism. And third, you want to get them hooked on capitalism. Same arguments were the ones that she used with regard to China. She said to me, you don't want to contain China, you want to engage China. You want to get it hooked on capitalism. It's imperative to create more institutions in Asia. And economic interdependence was the Sunday punch. So her view of how to deal with China, her view of NATO expansion was informed by theory. She did not like containment because she did not like basic realist logic. Madeleine Albright, despite the fact she would deny it to this day, thinks in theoretical terms. We have no choice, so never forget that. Now, with regard to the future, most of you are too young to appreciate this, but the 90s were really bad times for realists because it looked like Frank Fukuyama was right and that we had reached the end of history, or what I like to call the era of peace, love, and dope. Right? It was especially true here in Europe. Right? In Europe, most people thought that I was a Martian or a Jupiterian. They thought I was from another planet. Right? Mearsheimer just didn't get the word. Not simply that the Cold War is over, but the nature of international politics has undergone a fundamental transformation. Balance of power politics is gone. Security competition, all this stuff is gone. We live in a new world. So we realists had our work cut out for us in the 90s. But I do not think there are many people today who think realism is dead. The question on the table is, what is realism's future? And I hate to say it,